Tromelin Island lies in the northern reaches of the Indian Ocean, a small, low-lying coral island roughly half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. Its sandy shores are fringed with pale coral rubble, and the interior is marked by low shrubs, grasses, and scattered clumps of hardy vegetation. The island rises only a few feet above sea level, leaving it vulnerable to the constant wash of tides and seasonal storms. There are no natural freshwater sources, rainfall collects in shallow depressions, and moisture lingers briefly in the sand before evaporating under the sun. The surrounding waters are often clear, though punctuated by reefs and rocky outcrops that stretch far from the shore. These shallow reefs, while teeming with marine life, form hidden hazards for any approaching ship. The wind sweeps across the island unimpeded, bringing salt spray and a persistent, sharp heat during the day, and a chill under the open sky at night. The remoteness of Tromelin is striking. The nearest significant landmass is Madagascar, nearly 350 miles away, and the wider Mascarene Islands lie beyond the horizon. For an observer from the sea, Tromelin appears as a fragile strip of sand and vegetation, exposed to the elements yet oddly serene. Its isolation is total, human footprints are absent, and there is no evidence of permanent habitation. Birds will overhead, nesting in the shrubs, and occasional waves wash up the scattered remains of driftwood and coral. The landscape is quiet, measured, and indifferent, shaped by wind, tide, and sun rather than human hands. At this moment, Tromelin Island exists in equilibrium. There is no immediate danger, only the slow, rhythmic processes of the natural world. For those who might arrive, its beauty conceals the profound challenges of survival that lie ahead. In 1761, a French ship named Utile embarked from the port of Ile-de-France, now known as Mauritius, carrying a cargo that reflected the commercial and colonial priorities of the time. Its purpose was the transport of enslaved Malagasy individuals from the island of Madagascar to labor markets across the French territories in the Indian Ocean. The vessel was a modestly sized frigate, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy cargo, and it carried a crew accustomed to the rigors of long ocean voyages. The captain, Jean-François de la Roque, commanded a small complement of officers, sailors, and apprentices. Their experience varied. Some had navigated these waters before, while others were newly apprenticed to maritime life. They relied on the tools and knowledge available at the time, sextants, rudimentary maps, and dead reckoning to chart their course. The crew was disciplined but aware of the inherent dangers of sailing in the Indian Ocean, including sudden storms, shifting currents, and hidden reefs. The ship's human cargo was tightly confined below deck, in conditions that were harsh even by the standards of the 18th century. Food, water, and space were limited, and disease was a constant threat. The Malagasy men, women, and children carried with them not only their personal histories but also the profound trauma of forced removal from their homes. Their presence added a layer of complexity to the voyage. The crew's responsibility extended beyond navigation to the basic maintenance of life under constrained conditions. The route to the Mascarene Islands required careful planning. Navigational charts were incomplete, and the islands themselves were often visible only briefly through haze or rain. Captain La Roque and his officers made course adjustments based on prevailing winds and ocean currents, seeking to maintain a direct line to their destination while avoiding known hazards. Despite these precautions, the Indian Ocean remained unpredictable. Swells could rise suddenly, reefs could emerge from calm waters, and the weather could shift without warning. The motivation behind the journey was largely economic. The French East India Company and private traders sought labor for plantations and colonial settlements. Success was measured in the safe delivery of cargo, both human and material, rather than the welfare of those on board. Within this framework, the crew performed their duties methodically, maintaining the ship, steering through currents, and rationing supplies with precision. They understood the distance and isolation of their environment but believed in their capacity to navigate it. For the moment, the voyage proceeded according to plan. The wind filled the sails, the vessel moved steadily across the open ocean, and the lives aboard followed the routines imposed by maritime life, shifts at the helm, maintenance of sails and rigging, and monitoring the health of the passengers. The ocean, vast and unbroken, framed every aspect of daily life. The crew's experience and the ship's design offered a sense of order and control, even as the waters they traversed remained indifferent to human intentions. Yet beneath this routine, the potential for disaster existed. Every decision, every adjustment to the course, carried consequences in an environment where isolation could transform a navigational error into a life-threatening situation. The stage was set for events that would soon render the crew and their human cargo vulnerable to forces far beyond their control. In late November 1761, Utile approached the northeastern edge of the Mascarene Islands. Tromelin Island, a small, low-lying sandbank, appeared faintly on the horizon, largely uncharted and marked in the sailors' maps only as a hazard. Visibility was limited by haze and shifting winds, and the shallow reefs surrounding the island were concealed beneath the surface. The crew navigated cautiously, but the combination of inaccurate charts, strong currents, and the island's concealed coral fringes proved perilous. On the night of November 27, the ship ran aground on the reefs surrounding Tromelin. The vessel struck the coral with repeated force, and water began to breach the hull. Sailors worked quickly to lighten the ship, throwing overboard cargo and attempting to patch breaches, but the damage was severe. Panic remained subdued among the crew, replaced by methodical attempts to preserve life and salvage what could be carried. The passengers below deck, enslaved Malagasy men, women, and children, were trapped in a confined space, the effects of which would become immediately apparent as water entered the lower hold. Over the next hours, the crew organized a partial evacuation. A few lifeboats were deployed, but their capacity was insufficient to carry all aboard. In the confusion, the captain and officers prioritized their own survival and that of a limited number of crew members. Many of the enslaved Malagasy were left aboard the wreck or on the exposed reef with inadequate means of survival. Some were able to reach the small island, clinging to debris, while others perished in the surf. By dawn, Utile had broken apart, leaving survivors scattered along the narrow strip of sand. The island's remoteness was immediately apparent, the nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and the open ocean offered no immediate prospects for rescue. The shipwreck rendered the situation irreversible, any return to civilization was impossible without external aid. Those stranded faced an environment both fragile and unyielding. Freshwater was scarce, and the island offered little natural shelter. Coral and driftwood littered the sand, while the open sky exposed the survivors to sun and storm alike. For the first time, the reality of isolation became undeniable. The crew and Malagasy passengers, reduced in number and resources, were now entirely dependent on their own ability to adapt to the island's limited provisions. What had begun as a routine voyage for profit had become a confrontation with the raw constraints of survival. Decisions made in the days prior, the route taken, the handling of the ship, the allocation of resources, now defined the boundary between life and death. The full weight of isolation was just beginning to manifest. The first days on Tromelin Island were defined by necessity. Survivors quickly assessed their surroundings, noting the scarcity of natural resources and the absence of freshwater sources. Rainwater collected in shallow depressions and small rock basins, and the survivors relied on these ephemeral supplies to meet immediate needs. Freshwater was rationed carefully, and the group learned to identify the most reliable pools, scraping sediment from their bottoms to ensure drinkable water. Shelter was improvised from the wreckage that had washed ashore. Pieces of timber, sections of the ship's hull, and fragments of canvas were used to construct rudimentary windbreaks. These structures offered limited protection from sun and wind, though they could not withstand the full force of storms. Over time, survivors experimented with arrangements of driftwood and coral slabs, forming low enclosures that offered partial refuge and organized communal space. The construction of shelter was methodical, a matter of efficiency and endurance rather than comfort. Food sources were similarly constrained. Tromelin offered little in the way of vegetation, though seabirds nested in small colonies on the island. Eggs were collected from nests, and occasional birds were captured when possible. Fishing was attempted along the shallow reefs, where currents and jagged coral posed constant hazards. Survivors fashioned basic hooks and lines from salvaged materials, and even small catches were preserved in the shade or buried in sand to extend their usability. Every resource was measured, every portion rationed to maximize longevity. Daily routines developed out of necessity. Groups were assigned tasks, securing water, tending makeshift shelters, foraging for eggs, fishing, and monitoring the shoreline for passing ships. Time was structured around the natural rhythm of day and night, sun and tides. This organization created a framework within which survival could continue, providing both practical and psychological stability. Discipline and shared responsibility became critical. The physical strain of life on the island was constant. Exposure to sun and wind caused dehydration, sunburn, and fatigue. Saltwater irritated skin, and sleep was broken by heat or the chill of night. Survivors adapted by wearing improvised coverings from canvas or vegetation, alternating rest periods, and modifying activities to reduce physical exertion during the hottest hours. These adaptations were pragmatic, derived from observation rather than invention, and they evolved gradually as the group learned the island's patterns. Mental strategies were equally important. Isolation imposed a slow, cumulative pressure. Survivors maintained routines not only to meet immediate physical needs but to preserve focus and prevent despair. Collective tasks created structure and mutual oversight, while repetitive actions, gathering eggs, checking freshwater pools, reinforcing shelters, offered a form of cognitive stabilization. Survivors measured progress in small, tangible results, and the act of preserving life itself became a guiding principle. Knowledge was shared and recorded where possible. Instructions for making fire, collecting water, and handling food were passed among survivors. Even limited literacy or previous maritime experience contributed to the group's capacity to organize and adapt. Lessons were learned incrementally: which pools retained water longest, which bird eggs were safest to eat, which sections of coral could be navigated without injury. Observation became a form of survival literacy, an ongoing study of the environment. Time on Tromelin was both immediate and abstract. Days passed with the sun's movement, weeks became measured by rainfall and tidal patterns. The survivors' understanding of the island's resources deepened steadily, creating a sense of predictability within the otherwise unpredictable context of isolation. They marked the passing months by these natural cycles, counting incremental successes in obtaining water or food rather than relying on external calendars. Despite these adaptations, the constraints were severe. Nutritional intake remained minimal, and the human body responded to persistent scarcity. Energy was conserved, activity measured, and work shared to balance survival demands. Illness emerged sporadically, though records are limited regarding specific conditions beyond general signs of malnutrition, fatigue, and exposure. These challenges underscored the tenuous balance between endurance and collapse. Social organization evolved to meet these pressures. Survivors formed informal hierarchies based on experience and ability. Decision-making became collective where possible, though authority rested with those possessing knowledge of maritime practices or prior leadership roles. Cooperation was essential, and any disruption of these social structures risked immediate consequences for the group's ability to obtain water, food, and shelter. The use of fire, though limited by fuel scarcity, provided warmth, protection, and a means to cook food. Small hearths were constructed from coral and driftwood, carefully monitored to avoid waste or loss of valuable materials. Fire also functioned as a signaling tool, a methodical attempt to attract distant attention. Its presence marked both persistence and continuity, a quiet assertion of human survival within the island's isolation. Over months, survivors demonstrated remarkable adaptation. They refined shelter construction, improved foraging techniques, and developed strategies to minimize exposure to environmental hazards. Each step was incremental, guided by observation and trial. The survivors' endurance was not the result of heroic improvisation but of measured response to immediate needs and disciplined use of available resources. By the end of the first year, the group had achieved a relative equilibrium. They could reliably obtain water, capture birds, and maintain shelter sufficient for survival. Physical condition remained fragile, yet consistent routines and knowledge of the environment allowed for continued endurance. Time passed in cycles defined by tides, winds, and the limited vegetation of Tromelin. The island, unchanged and indifferent, persisted as a constant reference point. Its coral shores, sparse vegetation, and open sky framed every activity. Survival required continuous engagement with these elements, each day a repetition of practical efforts rather than dramatic feats. The experience of isolation was cumulative, marked by incremental adaptation, meticulous attention to resources, and the quiet endurance of human life under constrained circumstances. Through observation, organization, and careful use of limited resources, the survivors created a system that allowed life to continue. The pattern of daily survival became a sustained practice, transforming Tromelin from a site of sudden disaster into a domain where human persistence could endure. The lessons of this phase were evident in every shelter reinforced, every water pool scraped clean, and every small catch preserved. As months turned into years, the strain on the survivors intensified. Life on Tromelin Island was a continuous negotiation with scarcity. The initial systems of shelter, water collection, and foraging proved insufficient over extended periods. Pools of rainwater occasionally dried, nests of seabirds were depleted, and the limitations of the island became increasingly evident. Physical weakness became a slow but constant reality. The human body could only endure so long on such minimal nutrition. Malnutrition manifested in fatigue, brittle hair, and swelling from protein deficiency. Survivors moved deliberately to conserve energy, their routines shaped less by efficiency and more by necessity. Tasks once simple, such as collecting eggs or gathering firewood, became more arduous as strength declined. Illness and exposure to the elements compounded the challenge. Records indicate that several of the Malagasy passengers perished during these years, though precise numbers are uncertain. Each loss further altered the social structure, requiring the remaining survivors to redistribute labor and responsibilities. Psychological pressure accompanied physical deterioration. Isolation was total, no human presence beyond the small group could be relied upon. The survivors endured years without communication with the outside world, without certainty of rescue or reprieve. Monotony of routine and the repetition of survival tasks imposed a different form of strain, one measured in persistent vigilance, mental fatigue, and the quiet awareness of vulnerability. Attempts to signal passing ships were largely unsuccessful. Occasionally, distant sails appeared on the horizon, but the island's remote position, combined with the difficulty of creating visible signals, meant that these sightings rarely led to rescue. Survivors monitored the horizon with a structured routine, watching for weeks at a time without interruption. These efforts reflected both hope and necessity. Any sighting could be a potential lifeline, and no opportunity could be ignored. Social cohesion was tested under these conditions. Hierarchies and divisions emerged, shaped by experience, skill, and physical capability. Decision-making remained collective where feasible, though the strain of survival magnified the consequences of disagreement or inaction. Cooperation was critical. The collapse of collaboration would have had immediate effects on the group's ability to obtain water, food, and shelter. Over time, survivors developed deeper environmental knowledge. Observations of tides, bird patterns, and weather cycles informed daily routines. Techniques for conserving water improved, and strategies for collecting and storing food became more sophisticated. These incremental adaptations increased the likelihood of continued survival but could not eliminate the persistent threat of hunger, disease, and exposure. Each year passed with quiet endurance rather than measurable triumph. Life on Tromelin was defined by continuity of effort, by the methodical preservation of limited resources, and by the restraint required to survive. The passage of time blurred as months and years accumulated, punctuated only by the slow decline of strength, the occasional arrival of distant ships, and the constant demands of the environment. By the midpoint of this period, survival was no longer a temporary condition but a sustained existence. The island remained unchanged, indifferent to human endurance, while the survivors adapted with careful attention, observation, and a continual adjustment of daily practices. This struggle, while quiet and methodical, represented the full weight of long-term isolation. After 15 years on Tromelin Island, the remaining survivors were finally discovered in 1776. French sailors, returning to the region for navigational and commercial purposes, observed the island and noticed signs of human presence. Makeshift shelters, remnants of fire, and tracks in the sand indicated a small group had persisted in isolation long after the shipwreck of Utile. The rescue party approached carefully, aware of the island's history and its challenging conditions. The survivors, primarily Malagasy women and children, were weak, their physical condition reflecting the cumulative effects of prolonged malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Numbers had dwindled significantly from the original complement, and those who remained bore visible marks of long-term survival under harsh conditions. The operation to remove the survivors from Tromelin was methodical. They were brought aboard the ship, provided with food, water, and medical attention, and monitored for signs of shock or disease. There was no celebration, no dramatic acknowledgement. The scene was quiet and practical, focused on restoring the basic necessities of life. The sailors documented the survivors' condition, noting the resilience that had allowed them to endure years in isolation without structured support or external aid. The rescued Malagasy individuals returned to the French territories of the Indian Ocean, where they were reintegrated into colonial systems, though historical records provide limited information regarding their subsequent lives. The rescue itself marked the conclusion of their immediate ordeal, but it offered only a partial resolution. The full scope of loss, of family members, companions, and years of life, remained immeasurable, and the psychological effects of such prolonged isolation were unrecorded. The island, left behind once again, returned to its quiet state. Tromelin's coral shores, low vegetation, and open sky continued as before, indifferent to the human endurance it had witnessed. For the survivors, life outside the island required adaptation to social and physical contexts entirely different from the systems of survival they had developed on Tromelin. The rescue demonstrated that survival in extreme isolation was possible, yet it remained fragile and contingent upon both resourcefulness and circumstance. The incident would later serve as a historical record of endurance, loss, and human adaptation in one of the world's most isolated environments, quietly illustrating the limits and capacities of life under prolonged duress. The story of Tromelin Island endures as a quiet testament to human endurance and the fragility of life in isolation. Over 15 years, a small group of Malagasy women and children survived conditions that would have overwhelmed unprepared individuals. Their experience reflects not heroism in the conventional sense but the sustained application of observation, discipline, and adaptation under circumstances entirely beyond their control. Historically, the incident highlights multiple dimensions: the consequences of maritime miscalculations, the human cost of the transoceanic slave trade, and the vulnerability of individuals cast into extreme environments. Tromelin became a microcosm of isolation, where daily survival depended on knowledge of the natural world, careful rationing of resources, and the maintenance of social cooperation. The island remains largely unchanged, a small coral outcrop in the vast Indian Ocean. Its sands and reefs bear no visible trace of those who once endured there, yet the documented accounts preserve the memory of human persistence. The significance of Tromelin lies in its demonstration of endurance without embellishment. Life continued through methodical adaptation and quiet resilience. It serves as a historical record, a study in human survival under isolation, and a reminder of the broader contexts, geographical, social, and economic, that shape such endurance. The story closes not with triumph but with observation. Isolation ended, survival persisted, and history recorded the fragile persistence of life on an indifferent island.